To get some valuable insights on craft revival and national development, we now request our team member Avdi Mehta to introduce our first panel of speakers comprising Ms. Laila Tyabji and Ms. Neha Dewan. Over to you, Avdi. Avdi.
Thank you, Mohit, for the introduction. We feel privileged to host you all at the Virasat Craft Conclave, a celebration of preserving the languishing craft forms of India. Mahatma Gandhi once said, and I quote, "A nation's culture resides in the heart and soul of its people." And we are extremely grateful to have on board with us Ms. Laila Tyabji and Ms. Neha Dewan, eminent personalities who are connected with the artisans, considered as the soul of our nation. We are extremely grateful and honored to have you both here. Laila Tyabji ma'am is a leading social activist, designer, writer, craft revivalist, and a recipient of Padma Shri Award. She is the founding member and chairperson of Dastkar, a non-government organization working with craft people across India for promotion and revival of traditional crafts by linking rural craftsmen to urban consumers. We are honored to have you with us, ma'am. Ma'am, although you originally came from Belgium to become an artist, you went on to start Dastakar so as to preserve the art you stood for. Could you please tell us how exactly you got this idea to start Dastakar?
Can't hear you.
Ma'am, although you originally came from Belgium to become an artist, you went on to start Dastakar so as to preserve the art you stood for. Could you please tell us how exactly you got this idea to start Dastakar?
You're talking to me.
Yes, ma'am.
Ah. Well, I was only a small baby in Belgium, so there was a very long interval between coming back to India age 3 and starting Dastkar age oh, 35. So, I think that's quite a different journey, and the two had nothing to do with each other, except that my father was a diplomat. He was an Indian ambassador, not just in Belgium, but in many other countries. So I grew up half in India, half abroad. And I think when you live abroad, you realize all kinds of things about your country, which when you're living in India, you take for granted. And so I was always very conscious. And, I grew up in a home where my parents loved Indian crafts and Indian textiles. And they always had the embassy decorated with these things. And it was something that I really appreciated. And then I studied art. I thought I was going to be an artist. But gradually, sort of coming back to India and working, I started doing freelance design assignments in order to pay my rent, and uh, became more and more involved actually with working with people and with Indian traditions and skills to make things, whether one was doing an interior of a home or hotel, or whether it was doing sets and costumes for the stage and theater, or whether it was doing graphics or whatever. I always liked to work with craftspeople. And but I was freelancing, doing all kinds of things. And then when I was 29, I got a very exciting assignment to go as visiting designer to Kutch for the Gujarat State Handicrafts Corporation, which was just setting up. This was in 1977, 77 or 78, I think. And at that time, Kutch was really quite unknown. And in fact, when people asked me, and I said I was going to Kutch, they said, "Where's Kutch? Is it in Africa?" And it was that unknown. But it was a most amazing sort of period of my life and a real eye opener. I was there initially for 3 months, but I stayed on for 6 months, traveling around in villages and working with craftspeople, documenting their skills and seeing how they could be adapted for the urban market and the urban consumer. And remember that this was sort of 45 years ago. And now, of course, Kachi handicrafts and Gujarat embroideries and ajrak and all that have become almost a cliche. They're so well known. But at that time, really, people in the metro cities didn't know about these skills. And the craftspeople themselves didn't realize that uh, the skill that they had in their hands and the products that they were making had a potential, because they were making things for themselves, for their children's diaries, for their own homes, to decorate their camels and their sort of cattle. So it was very exciting, and it taught me, I think, a lesson that has stayed with me and possibly led to the kind of impetus which led to Dastkar, which was that unless you can empower craftspeople, you can't really improve the products. I mean, you may have all the most wonderful ideas in the world, but unless craftspeople understand that and see and have a motivation to make something better, unless you can give them access to good raw material, to learning things like costing and pricing and proportion and product design, you know, you may have all those dreams, but it doesn't really result in anything. And I think that's why when I came back to Delhi, although I did another sort of, I was visiting designer and merchandiser for the Taj Hotel, there was something at the back of my mind, and kept talking about how one could integrate craftspeople into this development process. And those conversations then led to Dastkar. I must point out that I'm not the founder of Dastkar. There were 5 of us who got together. And I think that was actually the strength of Dastkar initially, that there were 5 of us coming from very different backgrounds and professions. And we each brought something, both an idea and an expertise, that made Dastkar into this kind of holistic support organization for craftspeople.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Your journey is truly an inspiration. Since we have been working in the craft sector, we know it can be revived only if everyone from across nations comes together. Internationally, UNESCO is the only organization with a global vision of the socio-cultural and economic role played by crafts, and endeavors to develop a well-balanced action in favor of the sector. We are delighted to have with us Ms. Neha Dewan, our co-panelist, who is the Program Officer for Culture at UNESCO and Chair at Indian Women in International Relations. She has been actively working for the promotion of artists' welfare and is an expert in international relations and security. We extend a very warm welcome to you, ma'am. Ma'am, we have heard a lot of talks about initiatives taken by UNESCO for preserving the dying art forms. Would you like to tell us about your journey as the Program Officer for Culture at UNESCO?
Thank you very much, Abdi, for that kind introduction. And I think at the outset, I must begin by congratulating Enactus SRCC for all the fantastic work that you have been doing. And I think on that note, I might bring up an old amicable collegiate rivalry, because when I was at LSR, I was associated with Enactus. And I think one of the most memorable things from the time was how that amicable rivalry, as I say it, encouraged, I think, our societies to do more as young people for the craft sector and for cultural communities. And I think kudos to you to set up this platform following a devastating second wave of COVID in India. And I think we often talk about the impact across the sectors and across the global economy, but artists certainly, craftspersons certainly are some of the most drastically affected groups in that nexus. And I think, as you mentioned, UNESCO certainly is the only UN agency to have a mandate on culture. And since its inception and very foundation, it has focused on developing standard setting instruments, a set of recommendations recommendations and the means to localize them for different contexts. And I think in terms of my journey, I think every day is a new day at the culture sector, especially when you're working with South Asia, because there are so many rich traditions that you possibly can't even map them in a short conversation like this. And I'm sure I will introduce some of the themes as we go along this conversation. But I must mention that one of the most recent things that we've realized, and on the note of the impact of COVID-19, there have been several surveys, there have been several studies that have come along since the start of the pandemic, highlighting the impact on the culture sector. And UNESCO has also pioneered several of these reports. And one must say that we estimate globally over a loss of over 10 million jobs in the sector. And I must say there's a caveat that that's where these jobs are measured. In many times in countries like India, craftsperson and those associated with them form the informal sector. And there is a significant lack of data, of understanding of who are these practitioners, what are their contributions to not just the overall economy, but also the cultural economy and creative industries that countries pride themselves on, and who is the artisan and what's the impact on their life. And I think in this process, even going beyond numbers, what we realized at UNESCO was that there is a larger problem, as one would say, a structural issue, which is that while COVID did expose a lot of these incongruencies and the impact on the lives of artists, there is a larger question of their long-standing welfare. And I think in this context, I must also bring out one lesser known instrument of UNESCO, which has been in place for over 4 decades now. And we call it the 1980 recommendation concerning the status of the artist. And it truly is a very, very novel instrument because it talks about the artist as a professional and improving their status as professionals, improving their social status, and improving their economic status, and not just in a normative sense, but by improving policy structures that are in place, by introducing legislative measures, and by encouraging nations to build the capacity of professionals within the sector. And I think COVID has I think one of the unintended consequences of COVID has been to expose these long-standing issues and start a longer conversation about how can we sustain the lives of these artists, because indeed there are dying art forms, but they also have been endangered in many cases before COVID in the absence of these structures. So I think there are several conventions of UNESCO. There are many countries, including India, that have signed up to some of these commitments and promises to support the craft sector, the cultural industries. And I really look forward to unpacking some of these as we go forward. But for now, I'll pass the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. As mentioned by you, do you think we can implement some policies on the national or even state level for the prosperity of our artisans?
Absolutely. I think one of the core objectives of UNESCO within this sector is to ensure that the artisanal sector is represented in national development plans. And it strongly encouraged that culture, not just in terms of products and craft outputs, in terms of exports, should be the measures, but it also should be how well practices and traditional techniques are safeguarded, how they are transmitted between generations, how they're preserved over time. And certainly to ensure the continuity and survival of at least traditional art forms, it is absolutely quintessential for countries to measure the contributions, measure the impact, and bring in policies to sustain these art forms. And I also should, I think, talk a little bit about one of newer, more recent initiatives by UNESCO, which is what we call the 2030 thematic indicators for culture to measure sustainable development. And it really is like making an oblique intervention and encouraging countries to measure the contributions of culture and more indirectly the contributions of craftsperson in sustainable development, because very often we see culture as something that exists in parallel with social development, with economic development, but it's really about seeing them together and recognizing those linkages. And certainly there is a need for greater investments in culture as well to make sure that we can sustain these artists and art forms. And I must, I think, mention two of our ongoing projects here. One is with the government of Rajasthan, where UNESCO is supporting the direct capacity building, upskilling, linkages with digital markets, as some of the themes you mentioned in the beginning of this session as well, for artist communities across Jodhpur, Jaisalmer, Barmer, Bikaner. And the idea is to develop cultural hubs where these artists are, because I think one error that we unintentionally make is to remove the context of the artist, to remove the space which produces the art form for the artist and take out the product from that section. While of course it's essentially, it is very essential to bring the product, to bring those outputs to a larger community, it's also about making sure that the conditions of those artists where they are enable them to continue those art forms as well. And I think in terms of government endeavors as well, also since 2013 now, we've been collaborating with the MSME and T department at the government of West Bengal. And again, we're making direct interventions with rural artist communities by encouraging digital entrepreneurship, by incubating what we call creative enterprises where they are, and also looking at other aspects like gender and the role of women in these communities in not just, partaking in the building of these art forms and products, but transmitting them in next generations, and also mapping some of those hierarchies and seeing how they can evolve with time, because very often men are seen as the custodians of these traditions and art forms. But can we also look at empowering young women, for instance, to carry on these traditions, and how do we encourage the younger generation who very often find that it's much better perhaps to find other opportunities and let go, not out of an easy choice, of course, but out of circumstance, these traditions and art forms that have really survived for many centuries in some cases. So yeah, certainly a need to develop the community, certainly a need to measure contributions of culture in the development agenda, and take culture as an approach for sustainable development, I think, is one way to look at it at the national level.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such a detailed answer. Laila ma'am, as mentioned by Neha ma'am, like we basically take out the product from the artisans and we do not usually care about the artisans. So what do you think we can change in our way of, in our approach, so that we can take the artisans welfare also while looking into it?
Well, this is, of course, a crucial thing, and I was delighted to hear Neha talk about craftspeople as professionals, because of course they are, and they're among probably the most skilled professionals we have in this country, and it's a unique strength which very few other countries have. And yet, by and large, whether it is government schemes or whether it's civil society or whether it is our bureaucracy and our politicians, we tend to think of the craft sector as something that's antiquated, which is slightly primitive, because it's sort of rural based, and very few of the helping them get the tools, the further tools that even the most skilled professional does need in the 21st century, because society and technology is developing so fast that they need to be kept in pace with it. I think that we tend to look, and this sometimes happens even with very well-meaning NGOs, that we tend to look always at the artisan as the end product, that he has a product and he needs a market to sell it. Actually, it is a cyclical process, And it has to start way, way, way beyond the market, because, the the craftsperson has to be empowered to understand the market and to develop things for it. He has to learn how to interact with customers. He has to learn today all the digital skills that are required, and which many of us ourselves are just struggling to learn. And he needs to learn to be a good photographer. He needs to be a good mathematician. He needs to be a wonderful merchandiser. He needs to be able to bargain for the right raw materials. He needs a whole holistic set of skills. And at the core of this is really our understanding of the importance of this craftsperson and the respect that he is owed, and that he is a very integral and important part of Indian society. Not just culture, actually, but, not just aesthetics, but uh, society, economics, um, of course, the cultural history of India, our identity. These are all things which are actually dissolving in this global society, but which is actually something very unique that India has. We are striving to catch up with the rest of the world in many, many aspects. But this is something that India has, which is a unique sort of, actually a gold mine, as I often say, and which other countries in the world are dying to emulate and to copy and to have. We have the Chinese coming over and taking Kolhapuri chappal makers and Banarsi sari weavers to China to teach their craftspeople. But somehow we take it so much for granted. Just as when we drive to our offices and we see the Qutub Minar, and we don't realize what an extraordinary technological achievement it is that was made so many years ago of engineering and whatever. We just say, oh, that's the Qutub Minar. Similarly, we look at craftspeople, and perhaps almost the problem is that we have so many craftspeople. I mean, we have so many that we haven't even documented how many there are. The figures vary between 20 million to 200 million. Nobody has ever actually included all the ancillary workers that go into, say, a handloom weaver. I think there are 12 different processes that go in, and each of those actually gives an income and employment to an individual, sometimes 2 or 3 individuals. But we never tabulate them. We take it all for granted. And I think that, that is also the beginning of the development process, that we must know who they are, how many they are, where they are, what their skills are. And, to me, it seems quite shocking that even in the UNESCO listings, there's only, the Khateras are the only ones listed. When we were doing a listing for the All India Handicrafts Board about 40 years ago, I think we found 750 different craft skills, each of them then broken into, sort of by skills, because if you take embroidery, we have so many different types of embroidery in India that if we start counting those, we would really go into thousands. So I think respect is at the core of the way that we have to look at crafts, at the craft sector, admiration and recognition, but also assistance in more than just giving them marketing networks. I'm delighted that you are going online. So many organizations, including Dastkar, have seen in COVID times that really you have to have an online presence because people don't go to markets. Craftspeople have lost their bazaars, their buyers, etc. But before you have a product which is ready for online, before you have a craftsperson who's ready to effectively use online, there are many, many things that all of us have to learn, including the craftspeople, including ourselves. Because otherwise it will be just one more thing that will say, oh, we did it. But craft today in the 21st century doesn't really work. It's irrelevant. And we have to prove that that's not so.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such a detailed answer. You mentioned somewhere about the bazaars. We have heard a lot of things about Galiye Khas and the artisans-oriented bazaars which Dastkar sets up. Could you please tell us how you got the idea to set up these bazaars?
Well, again, I have to go back a very, very long way when Dastkar first started in 1981. Because now, of course, crafts bazaars are a dime a dozen. You know, we have permanent places like Delhi Haat. We have many, many organizations and government departments doing bazaars. There are Mahila Haats. There, different states are organizing crafts bazaars. But frankly, in 1981, there was a huge divide between craftspeople who were making things in their own villages and the urban consumer, who very often, particularly if they were young people, didn't even have any idea of what all these skills were that existed. And when Dastkar started working, and as I said, there were 5 of us, we started very informally. We all had our own jobs, but we started spending a few hours a week or a day a week each doing different things. And we had thought that the biggest problem was really the divide between urban and rural. And how do you get crafts into the mainstream market? And so we thought of, yes, we need design and product development, we need to contemporize, we need to improve quality, we need to cost, we need to get the right raw material, etc., etc. But frankly, and we always thought that these are the skills that we will teach craftspeople, because the whole idea was to make craftspeople sustainable and Dastkar to gradually withdraw and then start working with a new set of craftspeople. So we thought that once we had a marketable product and a craftsperson who knew the value of the craft and the cost of his product, there was no need for us to do anything else. And we very rapidly discovered that you could have a raider from Rajasthan with the most stunning leather bag made using punch work and stitchery and embroidery from Rajasthan, completely unique. But he couldn't even get into the office of a buyer, whether it was a retail store, whether it was a hotel chain, whether it was, a government emporium. The minute he arrived wearing his dhoti and his turban, the Darban would look at him and say, "Sorry, you can't come in." And that is when we realized that there was this other intermediary step, that we had to provide craftspeople with a market. They were not going to be able to access this market immediately themselves. So that is when the idea of the Dastkar Bazaar started, an alternative marketing thing, because we were very a small little organization without funds or anything. We took up space in the Triveni Kala Sangam, the open theater, and we invited, I think 1981, the first bazaar, we had 15 groups of craftspeople. Today, Dastkar worked with 750. And they came, and amazing though it seems now, when craftspeople travel the world and, so confidently arrive everywhere, this was the first time that many of them had been out of their village. We had to go and collect them from the railway station with placards. They stayed with us in our homes because they were so nervous. They hated the food. They hated the Delhi cold. The ones who wanted rotis didn't like the rice, and the rice eaters didn't like the rotis. And it was quite a challenge. And it was very interesting that customers too were so unused to seeing the people who actually make these things. Some people really got very emotional and looking at, say, Hasuben, who had embroidered something, and seeing her actually doing it, they actually welled up with tears and said, we never realized, we'll never bargain again because we now realize how long it takes. There were others, complete opposites, and Delhi customers. There were others who felt that, oh, these people are Hindi speaking, or sometimes not even Hindi speaking. They've come from the village, so we can bargain with them. And even though the things were very reasonably priced, they would try to beat the karigars down and make it cheaper and cheaper. So education of the consumer was as important as educating the craftsperson. And uh, we actually found that the bazaar was a very good mechanism, not just for making sales. So of course, that was very important because it proved to craftspeople that there was a market for what they made, but it was also a learning of what customer tastes were, what kind of colors, what kind of sizes, what kind of shapes people like to wear. And a lot of the things that that our Dastkar group had been trying to tell karigars, that you must use good material which doesn't bleed. It's better to spend a few extra rupees, but don't have something that runs color. And they would say, oh, big deal as long as our embroidery is great, why this fuss? Or sizing. Very difficult to explain to a village woman that you may put the most extraordinary embroidery onto a cushion cover, but if it isn't a perfect square, people won't buy it. And they said, you're going to sit on it. What difference does it make if it's half an inch here or half an inch there, as long as the work is good? And then when they had that experience at the bazaar of people picking up something and saying, oh, that's beautiful, and then say, oh, but it's 13 inches here and 15 inches here, and dropping it, suddenly the tube light came on and say, this is what Laila Ben always tells us, and maybe she was right. So it's a learning place, it's a platform. It's also a place where craftspeople meet each other. All of us who travel so much and go everywhere don't realize how unique this was, particularly in the 80s and 90s, where an artisan from Bihar suddenly met one from Karnataka, and they exchanged stories. They talked about what they learned. Someone who'd been to our bazaars 2 or 3 times would help someone who's come for the first time. And it became a development platform in a very happy, informal way. I've always not liked giving bhashans, whether it's about gender or whether it's about health or whether it's about education. I think it's much easier when you're just sitting around and you're actually making something, or after the bazaar is over, you're sitting and eating together, or you're at the dharamsala together and you're chatting, and a lot of these things happen very spontaneously. So we, even 40 years on, it's a shock to realize that Dastkar is 40 years now. We still find that the bazaar is a good mechanism. But it's an entry point for craftspeople and for customers to interact with craftspeople. It's not the be all and end all. They need to move on. They need to get orders at these bazaars for export, for lifestyle stores. Today, there are so many avenues for even all the online portals that have started. They shouldn't have to spend um, a week or 10 days or fortnight every 3 or 4 months to come and sell. Because, they're not salespeople, they're skilled craftspeople, they're artists. So the bazaar is a stepping stone. And once they've done that for 2 or 3 years, they should be able to sustain themselves without it.
Thank you, ma'am, for your valuable insights. Neha, ma'am, you mentioned before that we can sustain the artisans community by unifying them. Since you are experienced in international relations, could you give us some advice on how we can encourage these artisans. And also, even after we encourage these artisans, we the young generation does not actually like to buy the traditional products, since they are machine made, since they are very expensive as compared to the machine made products. Do you have any idea on how to incentivize these young people?
Thanks, Abdi. I think there are many themes in those questions. But I think first I do want to comment on the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage, which is supposed to be representative. And I think there is a larger policy onus on the country that sends in their nominations and their suggestions as well, because it's not just about, okay, here's a craft or here's a tradition or a practice, it's on the list now and that's the end of the story. That's really where the journey begins, because one of the key questions there is that how interested or what kind of plans does the country have to safeguard these traditions, safeguard the authenticity behind these traditions, and what about the communities and the consent of the communities, the role of the communities is one of the key things there. So without the communities, you can't just separate the element from it. And I'm sure that the unfortunate thing is, if we asked our audience to name, say, 5 World Heritage Sites in India, there would be instant answers. But if we ask them, okay, 5 intangible cultural elements, the heritage elements, there, I think the response would be much slower, because there is a problem about the awareness that needs to be built about these communities, about these art forms and crafts. And I'm sure once there is an investment in that area, there would be greater interest in that area, greater interest in mapping that area. And even at UNESCO, we are also working with private players, with other members of the community, with younger people who, of course, can identify built heritage markers around them and may know a bit about their history, but also how to explore or map or identify their own intangible cultural heritage that surrounds them so closely, but they may not be aware of. And I think on the international relations question, now I think for me that's a very interesting one, because culture features very strongly in the sort of international posturing for many countries. And we've seen more recently with the G20s and the G7s of the world that there is a greater need to put culture on the agenda. So there is certainly an inclination to talk about culture. And I think it's a great time to build that research, build that stakeholder and ownership to talk about culture at the international fora, but also not just from a top-down perspective, but also from a bottom-up perspective, to bring those perspectives and ideas of the artist communities to larger platforms. And I think on your question of sustainability of artists, and I mean, I don't think it's a competition in the sense of just picking out the cheaper good, because I think young people or even older people choose what they wish to buy very often, even based on where they see the value of that product. So it's not like it's always a choice of picking out the cheaper good in the market. It's also the narrative which surrounds that good. It's also the value that they understand, or the ownership of this product or good exists in the society. And I think, as Laila ji also mentioned, when we bring the stories of these people, when we bring the journeys of these artists with the product is no longer just an item which maybe in their assumption be overpriced. It's suddenly a marker of their culture. It's suddenly a marker of understanding how many years of oral communication, of traditions, of skills went into that, and what it may mean, how it separates them in a good sense, how it distinguishes their own cultural identity, their idea of the self, from, well, some products which anybody can own or can be overpriced. And I think we have been talking about bringing products to the market, about bringing in that digital market knowledge, but I think we should at some level be wary of over commercialization as well, because our aim is not to just bring a traditional craft to the market and answer those questions about, okay, how can we make it faster? How can we make it cheaper? The question is, how can we raise its social and normative values such that what it is priced at is understood better by the consumer? Because while we are consumers and producers of culture, there is, I think, a link between those aspects. And I think there is just a greater need for recognition of that. And certainly one of the biggest aims of any crafts or handicrafts related endeavors should be to look at the self-sustainability of the artist as well, of improving their conditions where they are, of improving their needs for interest. I mean, naturally, if there is a crafts person who spends a number of years learning a craft growing up, spends a large amount of time, producing a certain product, and then suddenly at, I think, the helm of their youth is told that, why don't you choose a job in engineering, or why don't you take up, a post-graduation course which might get you a better job? I think that's the narrative that we need to slowly deconstruct and rebuild. And that's why it's so important to bring in that idea of seeing craftspersons as professionals and give them both the social and the professional respect that they deserve. So it's beyond just the diversity of our cultural expressions and the unity in diversity ideas, but it's also to see them as markers of sustainable development of our economic well-being as societies. I hope that answers your questions.
Yes, ma'am, of course. Thank you so much for your invaluable insights. We have all of us have got a lot of insights about the functioning and challenges of the torchbearers of our heritage, and we have you to thank for it. Before we end this session, if you could please say a last few words.
I think, Laila ji, would you like to go first, please?
Yes, I'm actually dying to answer that last question, because you said something about, that the younger generation doesn't want to buy craft. And I think there are sort of three different reasons for that. One is that they don't know enough about what is available in craft. And I think it's important to remember that craft is a form of production. It does not mean that you have to wear something which comes out of Mughal-e-Azam, and look like a sort of fancy dress. You can wear the most stunning contemporary clothes and still have them embellished by craft. Whether it's block printing, whether it's bandhani, whether it's embroidery, you can use it in any way possible. And if actually people who worked with craft shook their minds out of the fact that craft always has to look exactly the same as it looked 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 300 years ago, I think it would be much easier to find a market. I'm not saying that you have to completely turn craft into something which is either Western looking or whatever. The craft skill, the technique, the motif tradition is the signature of crafts, and that's its strength. But you can use that to design something which looks very contemporary and which is also functional and which looks good in your homes. So that's one. The second bit, and where I think that organizations like UNESCO or the government of India or whatever have to play a part, because I think NGOs just don't have the resources to do that, is to create that awareness. I think that unless we promote and actively put out and present the richness of what we have in the craft sector, in terms of techniques, in terms of materials, in terms of designs, and in terms of people who are still living skilled professionals in those crafts, no one is going to go. Today, consumers don't have that energy and time to go out to some Maidan where there's a craft bazaar. They certainly don't have the capability of trekking out to Kutch or to Bihar or whatever just because they want to buy a piece of ajrak or a piece of madhubani. So we have to both bring it in an attractive, contemporary way to the marketplace, but we also have to create that awareness that that exists and it's worth having. We all know what an extraordinary impact the Incredible India campaign had on even domestic tourism, where people who only knew about, the Golden Triangle of Agra, Delhi, Jaipur, suddenly began traveling to all kinds of quite small, unknown places in India because there was this amazing campaign on uh, our, our TV screens, on cinemas, in magazines. And I think we need something like that for craft. And to make that look exciting and interesting, and to show, how alive craft is, how adaptable it is to all kinds of functions and uses, how actually still very contemporary it is. And I think the third point is at a time when I think most consumers are getting a little tired of this branding. It was very exciting when India opened up and brands suddenly became available. But I think today people want to look different from each other. And one way that you can look absolutely unique is to wear handcraft, because each piece can be different. It's not like a brand which has to make, I don't know how many millions of yards of fabric in order to become sustainable. You can change the color and design on a sari or a dupatta every 3 meters without it costing any more. So I think we have to put all this information there. We have to make people aware of it. We have to also build a lot of hostler, a lot of confidence among craftspeople themselves that there is a future for them and their children. And I think these are all the steps which have to happen side by side with the product development, the skilling, the training, and the market platforms. My hair has gone gray in the process. Now it's your generation's turn.
Yes, of course, ma'am. I really hope that through these inspirational words, many people would change their thought process and the craft sector would flourish as it used to. Neha,
Well, I
ma'am,
think
what would you like?
what Petal has done is quite extraordinary. You've taken a completely um, almost dying craft and something that people associated only with their grandmother's kitchens into something which is so exciting and vibrant and fun. And I love to see you at our Dastkar bazaars, and people of all ages and all nationalities coming and looking at this wonderful, vibrant, shiny products and how beautiful they are. And I don't think any plastic or Tetra Pak or anything can match it. And it's not even that expensive. Maybe it should be a little more expensive actually, but anyway, that's another matter.
Yes, ma'am. Very rightly said, ma'am. Neha, ma'am, what would you like to say about this?
I think one of the first things I would mention, or rather invite the audience today, is to really explore some of the stories that, at least at UNESCO, we've tried to bring out. We've tried to bring out the voices of Pattachitra craftspersons from Pingla to Jutti pottery, miniature painting makers from Rajasthan. And I think the onus is on the social media, young people generation to really disseminate the word and stand in solidarity with these artists and craftspersons with the same enthusiasm that we share other campaigns on social media. And I think with this, there is also the idea that while we safeguard that traditional knowledge, those practices, those communities that practice them, we also need to prepare them for the future, for contemporary challenges. I think over half the world's population lives in cities today, in urban centers. And we need to ensure that this gap between the rural and urban, between where craft spaces lie versus where the idea of this modern lies, that gap needs to be bridged a lot more. There will be a need to talk about environmentally conscious choices in our choice of products that we consume. And I see more and more societies, modern sort of communities go back to handicraft and handloom traditions because they use natural products or, organic colors as they are called. So I think there is a scope for revival, and there is a great benefit that can or synergy that can be developed by looking at some of these areas as well. And I would also encourage, I think one of the best means for survival is for young people who research into these dying art forms or endangered textiles. I mean, India in itself, I think, is one of the offers one of the largest scopes. So any kind of anthropological, sociological, political study into every single kind of art form, because they have such a large traditional history to them. So certainly, I think a participation in that is one of the key means, and there is a lot of interest from outside of India into these traditions. So why not young Indians who should study these communities, work with these communities, and try to safeguard their future bit by bit. So yeah, I think I'll just conclude there.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Your words were truly an inspiration. I would now like to close this session with a yearning that many more young people would join hands to preserve the glorious yet diminishing craft sector of our nation. Your words have inspired us in the true sense. It was truly our privilege to host you both. I would like to thank you from the bottom of my heart.